Welcome, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us for another Fit Nation Lunch and Learn. Today, we are joined by Sarah Mannerings. Sarah, thank you so much for taking the opportunity to join Derek and I today.
Hi, how you doing?
Doing really good. Thank you so much for asking. And so for those of you guys who didn't read the email and see a little bit of a background of Sarah and what she does, Sarah, you come from a little bit of a different background from most of our guests, where it's not a fitness background, but you're actually an interior designer. So
Yeah.
maybe the question to kick it off is, how long have you been working with fitness and wellness brands, and how did you come to make this one of your specialty areas?
Yeah, so I actually I started my career in brands and interior design. So I actually trained in interior architecture at university, and started working in the industry for interior design companies that were actually kind of broader and kind of more multidisciplinary. So I worked across retail, hospitality, and leisure, working on bars, restaurants, shops, and kind of leisure spaces as well. But the kind of underlying theme across all of the companies that I worked for is that they were very brand centric. So I got a lot of experience with, despite having trained in interior architecture, I got a lot of experience with actually developing the brand. So like the strategy, the story, kind of the purpose that would sit behind a brand, and then learned about how to transition that into the interior design. So that was kind of where I started, and I worked my way up to kind of project leader roles, head of interior roles. I've always been very ambitious, so I worked my way up as quickly as I could. But I always had a mission to kind of have my own business. So I took the plunge about 3 years ago and kind of landed on my feet in a way. It was actually a bit of a happy accident that I kind of ended up specializing in fitness and wellness, because one of the clients that I worked with in a previous company on a restaurant, he decided to start a fitness brand, and we had a great time working together on his restaurant. So he contacted me, and he knew I was also personally really into fitness and wellness. He knew I worked out a lot, and he said, look, I think you can do this, like, just take it on. And within a couple of weeks of launching my own business, I was working on his gym brand, and that brand is Robots. So Robots I'm still working with today, 3 years later. They've just received funding for rollout, and I'm currently working on their second site. It's actually on site at the moment. So it was a happy accident, and then I just loved working on that brand so much that and it was such a perfect fit for me being in fitness and wellness that it kind of grew from there, and I got word of mouth recommendations from other fitness to work on other fitness brands. And before I knew it, I was kind of specializing in that area. But as I say, because I loved fitness and wellness so much, I already knew so much about it. It came easy.
That is super cool, and I've personally had the chance in order to take a look at your website. But if so, I know the brand Robots, and I love the concept in that. If you wouldn't mind, could you elaborate a little bit on what is Robots and the brand and kind of your approach there?
Sure. So Robots is a boutique fitness concept. So I'm sure most of the listeners are familiar with boutique fitness concepts, but it's class-based as opposed to kind of a big box gym where you can go and work out on your own. It's completely 100% class-based. So the concept is you mix between splits on the rower and splits on the floor. It's really, really high intensity. I'm sure everybody's jumped on a rower before, but you'll find like 5 minutes on a rower is completely different to 5 minutes on a treadmill. So it's a really, really hard workout. But what when they came to me at the start, they said, what we want to do is actually start weaving in this kind of mental health aspect in our classes. So the classes are actually named after certain kind of mental health aspects that they wanted to address. So you'll have like a recharge class or a reset class on a Monday, and the whole idea is that it kind of resets you from failure. So you actually go into this class feeling maybe a little bit like you're out of kilter and you're maybe not where you want to be, but after this class you feel like you can smash it. And they actually like push you in the physical way, but actually talk to you through your mind as well, and kind of address kind of mental barriers that might be making you feel the way that you feel. They've got a lady called Zoe Aston, who's actually a kind of mental health professional who works on the development of the classes and worked on the development of the brand alongside me. Like I would talk to her about what she wanted to do with the classes as I was developing the brand. So We've even noticed how kind of like Barry's Bootcamp and One Rebel and everyone are starting to do the same. So it was something that we knew from the outset would be where kind of everyone would be going. So that's kind of how they work. And then from a brand and kind of concept level, the story we wanted to create, we had this idea of being inspired almost by a post-apocalyptic world where people had to be the strongest that they could be, both mentally and physically, and they would descend below ground to train to almost fight in this apocalypse. So the kind of design cues that we've incorporated are very, very raw, kind of inspired by that post-apocalyptic world. And then as you move into the change rooms, they feel kind of quite ethereal, really modern, and the pace slows down. So the idea is you're in this class where it feels super high intensity, and you kind of push yourself, but then it's almost like you've transitioned to the new world. When you go into the change rooms and you get to relax, the pace slows, but that's very deliberate so that you calm down before you kind of re-emerge into the outside world, ready to finish your day.
Yeah, that is super cool. And in the show notes, we can probably put a link to the site so that this way the people who are listening in can visit. It's really super cool in order to be able to see what the finished product look like. I can only imagine how awesome it would be to be in the facility to experience it. And so, one of the things that I feel that is the difference between some of our other guests is whenever they're talking about the brand, they're always explaining about how the people are contributing to the brand. But this is a great opportunity because now we can talk about other aspects, specifically design and how it contributes to the brand itself as well. Would you mind sharing a little bit about how design is important to the overall brand experience?
I'm obviously biased because I work on brand and interior design, but I think the thing about design it's the key is to understand you're trying to effectively preempt problems in the space. So you're trying to preempt problems that the customer might have, or preempt things the staff might need. And when you build the design, you need to do that. Ideally, you do that before you actually start investing time and investing money into your brick and mortar site. And from my point of view, I feel like the more I know about what you're trying to achieve, the more I know about what the customer might want from your brand, and understand their demographic, the more I understand about your staff and the instructors and how they want to work the space, the more I can preempt these problems. So when I sit down with clients, I tend to write a list of kind of these problems and these ideas and these scenarios that they might come across, understand what goals they're trying to achieve, what will define success for them, and that will help me design the actual space and the brand. So once I kind of understand that, I tend to do that in kind of a workshop environment. So we actually sit around and I try to download everything that's in their head and that's been kicking around for like several months or years in some people's cases. And my kind of ultimate aim is to get in your head. So that, and that's the best feedback I can ever have, is when I walk out of a workshop and people are like, I feel like you're in my head. So that's kind of my goal. Once I understand what you're trying to achieve, or people are trying to achieve, I'll sit down and I'll start to try and build the brand and the brand story and define the purpose that sits behind that brand. You may or may not have come across in kind of marketing terminologies this concept of storytelling, but you can't really storytell and kind of inspire customers unless you've got that kind of brand story behind you and you've worked out what your purpose is and kind of the point of that purpose is that it's supposed to resonate with the customers, resonate with the staff, and it helps people understand what you're trying to achieve. So once we've understood that, we can then, in the design stage, actually bring that story to life. And this is where it gets really quite clever, is you use design to actually tell a story. So I see kind of the brand as the storyteller, but the interior is kind of the theatre where you tell that story, if that makes sense.
Yeah, that's actually a really cool analogy to think of as well. So I'm thinking about the theater itself. Obviously, you've worked with many different fitness brands, but also retail as well. When you're thinking about putting yourself in their mind, whether it's from, what's their problem, what are they looking to resolve, etc. Do you see that it's kind of different to work with the two different industries, or would you say overall they're quite similar and how you would approach it?
Yeah, I mean, so a lot of my experience, as you just mentioned, is retail and leisure sector, but also hospitality as well, like restaurants and things. And there are similarities in the creative process, but the key difference is understanding the consumer mindset. There are subtle differences between the consumer mindset. So whereas in a retail space, the consumer might be hung up on kind of value and also speed and how quickly they can move through a space. And in a restaurant, people are looking maybe to have somewhere they can relax, they can escape. In the fitness world, you have to, I think the key is understanding the vulnerability of the consumer mindset. And I think the vulnerability for the consumer in a fitness world is the thing that kind of affects motivation in fitness. So the thing with branding is, and this is the thing that actually got me into it, is there's so much psychology behind it. So I'll try and elaborate and hopefully it will make sense. But if you think about it, we've all been in that place where you know you need to work out, but you kind of put it off a little bit and you end up maybe not going, or you mess around a little bit in the gym, or you don't do what you want to do, and you end up leave feeling not great. And that's usually down to a psychological barrier. So it might be that you feel, one person might feel quite vulnerable about their body, another might actually have this kind of idea in their head that they're going to fail, or that they're not good enough. But usually there's some sort of vulnerability, particularly in fitness, that kind of puts you off from actually going to work out. So when I'm designing for a fitness brand, I try and understand that vulnerability. And when it gets really clever and really interesting is if you can create a brand world, I like to call them kind of brand worlds, and that's this kind of theatre that's really exciting and really engaging and it's very experiential. You actually kind of distract the consumer from the fact that they're working out, because they're so immersed in this incredible environment with this great music and lights and a whole story behind it, that they're just having such a great time working out that they actually forget all about their vulnerabilities. And this is where lighting can be so clever, and why kind of these dark spaces work so well, because you're kind of semi-hidden as well. So you get to kind of put aside all of those barriers and almost come out of your shell and actually push yourself without feeling like everyone's watching you. But even so, I would say that applies quite well and explains kind of the boutique sector. But where you've got kind of big box gyms as well, you need to still think about vulnerabilities, because people are going in and their body is quite exposed, and where one person might feel quite confident, another person might not, and they might be standing trying to work out next to someone that they feel really inferior to. So one person might actually want to stand there and be showing off their body and they thrive off that. Another person might want the ability to hide. So you need to kind of think about that with equipment placement. Even little things like some equipment, when women are working on it, they feel quite vulnerable, whereas men working on it won't. So you need to kind of think about all of these, call them vulnerabilities, when you're actually designing the fitness space, because as long as if you can take those stresses away, then people they have less excuses to not come to your gym. And the more they come to your gym, the more they connect with your brand, and the more that builds brand loyalty, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it absolutely does. And as soon as you said consumer mindset, it got me thinking in a slightly different but similar topic. I think all industries have changed over, just the past year, but obviously over even longer time period than that. There's been more changes, but curious to know basically how the industry has changed, and I guess your approach to kind of that consumer mindset. And one thing I guess I'm relating that to is there anything you're doing differently, for instance, in the second location of robots as opposed to the first?
Well, I think just touching on the industry bit, I think I mentioned the word experiential earlier, and I think that's definitely a trend that I've seen change in the last sort of 5 to 10 years, is just this rise in experiential brands. And I think that's where like really clever brands are realizing the importance of experience and giving people another reason to connect to the brand. In the robot second site, we, funnily enough, we even pre-COVID, we'd started talking about a hybrid model, and bringing in kind of online fitness and physical fitness together. So we knew we wanted to start having recording areas. So they don't have the luxury of actually having enough space to have a dedicated recording studio. But like within the design of the studio space, we made sure there's somewhere that they can do the filming. The site one was a really, really tiny space. I had to work really, really hard to get everything in. It was actually, before we took it over, it was an old car park, which was just literally for one car. One very luxury car, and it was just a little garage door, and you go in and you descend below ground, and it had a turntable for the car to then be able to reverse into a space. And that garage we turned into a gym for 20 people with 2 separate changing rooms and a reception. So I had to work the space really hard. The second site, we've got a luxury of a much larger space, and it's also on a ground floor level, which makes it really nice because it can be a proper flagship, because you've actually got kind of glass frontage, which will be great. So we've really tried to make the most of that glass frontage and build quite a kind of high profile shake area, somewhere where people can really hang out and socialize. And I think that's drawing off the back of kind of this recognition that when people interact with fitness brands, they also want a sense of community and somewhere where they can socialize and hang out. It's no longer just a functional space where people go and get fit. Like they want to hang out there. They want to have a shake afterwards. They want to chat to people that from the class. They want to chat to the instructors, and sometimes even just sit there and do a bit of work. I think it's just become so much more than somewhere to be healthy. It's now somewhere that become part of their lifestyle and part of a community.
You were explaining vulnerabilities and how when designing a space you need to think about people's vulnerabilities in that, and it just immediately made me think to a conversation that I had with my wife, where we were talking about how we work out within a space. And so if I'm doing, for example, deadlifts in a particular area where they have the equipment, I never thought about it. I just don't mind doing my deadlift there. But my wife told me that she doesn't actually like doing deadlifts within that particular area because she feels like she's on display and doesn't want people looking at her butt. And so she goes to another area of the gym in order to be able to work out. And so so basically that's tied in super, super well. And I feel like this is potentially a mistake that the gym made in the process of putting together and laying out their equipment and maybe even design overall. Are there any other common mistakes that you see made by brands that don't have a design eye? And maybe as a follow-up, how can they address some of these things?
Yeah, there's everything that you said makes complete sense, and there's really common mistakes I see that I guess as a designer, I don't just do this with gym brands either. I do it with everything that I walk into. I'm always like, why did they put that there, or why did they do this? And like just as you say, it's really, really common that certain people working out in the gym won't like the placement of some equipment. And if you don't think about these things really early, then you can end up putting power locations, or in the context of a squat rack or anything like that, you'll need reinforcement in the floor. And if you put that in the wrong place because you've not thought about it early enough, it's very, very hard to rectify that. And it can be a massive upheaval if you don't actually think about that early enough. A gym brand I was talking to recently, they were saying that a lot of the problem they've got is they've had complaints they've not got mirrors near the equipment, so people can't check their form, but they didn't think about it early enough. So to reformat the whole gym, they'd have to actually run new power, because they didn't put the power in the weights area because they assumed that would be the weights area. Now they need to rejig the whole thing, and they need to actually run power everywhere. So you really got to think about it. And if you're not sure, I would say like the recommendation would be to just err on the side of caution and make sure you build in flexibility as much as you can. But kind of you talked about other common mistakes people make. I think for me, I work in the world of brands, so I get brand, I get how important it is, but I think that it just isn't something that is on some people's radars when they start a gym brand, and they can end up thinking too much on a functional level and getting hung up on just equipment and budgets and air conditioning and things, and they forget that whole brand element. that is so valuable and kind of critical in today's market. And customers are really brand savvy now, so they expect so much more than just a gym space. So if you don't think about that kind of story at the outset and how you might design the space and actually build in an experiential feel, I think you're going to be a little bit on the back foot. I think another really common mistake that I see people make is, and it's not really their fault, but there's a lot of design agencies out there and they all have different specialisms. And I kind of think it's the responsibility of the designers to really explain what type of designer they are and whether they're to help the customer, or my customer, the client, or the brand, understand if they're the right fit. So just to elaborate on that a little bit, you've got kind of some gym designers that focus very much on equipment specification and equipment layout, and they work quite well for kind of a big box gym, but maybe not so much for a boutique gym. I think a boutique gym, you really need someone who gets that experiential feel. People who lay out equipment they're very, very knowledgeable about actual equipment and spacing, but they very rarely have that like brand centric approach and understand the experience. So if that's important to you, then they won't be the right fit to you. Likewise, some people that's not important to them. There are design and build companies as well who will actually do the kind of design and also build the site. And I say do the design, but again, because they kind of cover every touch point, it tends to not be as strong on the design side. But they're very good if you've got a budget that you want to work to, because they can help manage that, because they're going to be doing the build as well. Then you've got people who are really great at design, but they might not actually have much knowledge of the equipment or the gym world. So I see what I've found. I've picked up a lot of clients who come to me and they've actually just started working with completely the wrong type of designer. So I think it's really important at the outset when fitness brands want to start working with someone that they really ask them what they're delivering and work out whether it is really the right fit for them. Because it's a really costly mistake if you have to change designers or kind of redo the whole thing or retrofit things. I mean, in my opinion, I think you need someone that covers, if you really want to be successful, you need someone who covers every aspect. I really would never recommend not having someone think about your brand. You really do want to be thinking about the functional stuff. Obviously, it's so important with gyms. And nowadays, I think budget is incredibly important, especially if you want to, attract investors down the line. They're going to be wanting to understand those numbers as well. So you need to be thinking about every single touch point and not kind of scrimp and save in any area, because it will come back to bite you. I think there's a kind of saying like, is it something like designers are really expensive, but it's something like, great designers are really expensive, but see how costly it can be to get a bad designer or a cheap designer or something like that. I've completely butchered it, but I think people try and scrimp and save. The point is people try and save money, and then it costs them way more in the long run when they have to redo it.
Absolutely, yeah. I think that can be said with a lot of things in life, and are there and also in some of the things that we've already mentioned. So we've talked about neglecting specific audience with poor design choice. Are there any other consequences that we should be taking into consideration within a poor design, and maybe how is that different from different types of brands as well, and how it specifically relates in fitness?
So I mean, there's quite a lot of mistakes people make, as you can imagine. I think something that springs to mind quite a lot with fitness is when people are picking the site, with fitness, and depending on the type of concept that you want to have, people quite often end up taking like basement sites, because in a fitness space where it can be quite dark, they don't really need light, bright daylight. So when they take the basement sites, what I see quite a lot is they don't think about ceiling height. It's a really, really kind of easy one to sort of forget when you see this really cool basement site, and you see it, especially if it's raw and nothing's fitted out yet. You might think, this is great, this is going to have so much kind of mood and drama, it's going to just be awesome. But then you've got to whack in an acoustic floor, and you've got to whack in M&E equipment and acoustic ceiling, because of course we all want our music pumped up maximum volume. And I'm not talking about a tiny little bit, like acoustic floors can be sort of 150 deep. If I'm being really specific, I think the last one I worked on was like 133 mil deep or something, but it varies depending on how well insulated the shell is, so it does vary. And then again, you could lose another 150 off the ceiling for acoustics, and then you're going to lose probably 300 or 400 mil for your air conditioning. And suddenly, if you've got a low height and you want to have a class where people are doing burpees, or you want to put in equipment with chin-up bars, pull-ups for people to do pull-ups, or even worse still, like muscle-ups, where you've got to get right up, you're going to need quite a lot of ceiling space. So if you've actually signed on the dotted line and you've got that site, and then you get a designer in, and then you start talking about it, there's nothing you can do. So that's just one technical example, but it kind of ties into a bigger problem where, and this is so common, is people will sort of call me up and ask me to help on something, and they'll tell me that they've already got a site and they're closing on it in a couple of weeks, and they don't realize that great design takes a really long time. When I say really long, I don't mean years, but if you want to do it really well, you need to carve out a good few months. If you're developing it from scratch and the brand doesn't even exist, you're going to need time to develop that brand, understand what's going to be important to the customer, research the customer, research the competitor market, research just everything. That takes a lot of time. And so if you want to do it properly, you need to do that. And then actually building the design and foreseeing things like how we resolve ceiling height problems, that takes time too. So if you've got a site and you've got a rent-free period that starts the moment that you get the keys, you're going to be eating into that rent-free period on the actual design, when you really want to be eating into the rent-free period on your build. So if I was going to say one of the biggest mistakes people make is they just don't get the designers in early enough, because we can start working on the design before you have a site. Like, don't worry about it. I think this is the thing. People think we need a site to actually like design, but we don't. We can design in a very hypothetical space, and we can build the brand completely in our imagination, and we can figure out an optimum size of the site working with you. So, for example, Robot's second site is 2,700 square feet. So we can just design a blank box to that size, work out the number of change rooms we can fit in, work out the number of rowers or a bit of equipment or whatever we're doing. We can work that all out. And then you can go and find a site that fits the parameters of your brand. So then you know that your site is going to work for your brand, rather than shoehorning a brand into a site that isn't quite right. Does that kind of make sense?
Yeah, makes sense. And I'm curious, Sarah, is with some of the clients you've worked with in the past, do they actually have you look at places before they buy them now, just to get your opinion on them?
Yeah, all the time.
Oh, okay.
I end up working so quite cool because I'm an independent as well. I've deliberately set up as an independent because I personally wanted to have quite a personal experience with my customers. I wanted to become part of their team. And they call me up about everything. They want to know what I think before they make any decision sometimes. But yeah, I definitely go around with them when they start looking at new sites, and kind of, especially if we've already got that hypothetical model, then we can start looking at it and saying, well, this can go there and that can go there, and well, that might be a problem because we won't be able to achieve this. And yeah, that we definitely do that.
Yeah, it makes sense, because I was just thinking back to the question Kaylin had asked you about the mistakes, and like some of the ones that were for you were like so obvious. I was like thinking about like, oh yeah, that would really mess some things up. So I can imagine after the first time they would want to bring the designers in as early as possible. So just wanted to validate that. But I'm curious, when we talk about digital, I think you even said it yourself that Robots, for example, is doing a bit of hybrid.
Mm-hmm.
So I imagine that you're gonna say that there's a little bit of a different setup for a more of a digital environment. So I guess with someone like robots, how would they take into consideration both that in person, but then also doing a bit of online or remote? And how do you kind of mix them into like a single place?
Yeah, so I think, well, there's a lot of differences between obviously the online and in-person experience. When you're actually on a site, in a physical location, you've got the benefit of the environment being able to motivate the customer. You've got incredible lighting, incredible sound systems, and also even just the other people in the room. You're all bouncing off each other, and that kind of creates this incredible energy. It's difficult with the online kind of world because all of that motivational burden falls on the instructor to kind of be able to generate it, but through a screen. So it's really, really hard. The thing with branding as well, which I think loads of people don't realize, is you actually spend a lot of time talking about brand values for the actual staff kind of communication style as well. So you make sure that the staff you employ can actually be aligned with your brand. So someone like robots, one of our core values was empowerment. And we wanted to make sure the instructors were the types of people that would empower you when you're working out. And so when they were actually interviewed, and I even went to some of the interviews, that's what I mean when I get involved in everything. But so when they interview the staff, they can make sure that those staff will be able to create that kind of feel in a physical space. Now, in the online world, if you've got the same instructors, hopefully if you've nailed it, then they can also create that feel through the screen. And if they follow the brand values about the communication style, then they should be able to do that. But I think a lot more burden does go on them. And I mean, I mentioned it to you guys when we first started this call that I'm not that natural on camera, but I'm actually fine if you chuck me on stage in front of 400 people. I don't know what it's about. But unfortunately, some instructors have that same problem. They get on a camera, and it doesn't matter how great they were in their interview and how great they are in the studio, when you put them on camera, something changes. And it's really important for brands to actually train instructors to help them be able to be comfortable on camera. So then that kind of makes you think about the actual instructors and how they work. But then in the actual space, the physical space, it's really difficult. I think probably a lot of brands that are listening to this will understand this, but it's very difficult to get brand consistency when instructors are filming from their own homes, and all their homes are kind of different sizes. They have different lighting. Sometimes there's kids running around. It's really, really hard. It's very difficult to get brand consistency in the instructors' homes. And I've talked to various brands about ways that we can do this, but we've kind of come to the conclusion that it is just difficult to change that backdrop. So I think what brands like robots, they do this, and I would recommend other brands look into, is actually trying to use software to create that brand consistency. So you actually create an overlay using software like Streamlabs or OBS Studio or something, and you can create an overlay on your screen. And the important thing about that is it means that when people watch kind of online videos and they've got things in gallery mode, they can really quickly pick up the instructor and identify them and follow them. And then this is where it gets interesting for me, because I try to think about not what is the problem, like the fact that people struggle to find an instructor, but why does it matter? And the thing is, it does matter, because if someone can't find the instructor on their gallery screen, or if they can't follow what the instructor's doing, they get lost and then they get stressed. And I think I talked before about stresses in the physical environment, where if you feel vulnerable or you don't have a mirror or something like that, you have stresses too at home, but they're completely different. So you feel stressed probably before you've even started about, will I be able to follow this? Am I going to get lost? Am I going to understand the moves? Are people going to look at my house and think, well, what's all that mess? Or am I going to get interrupted by my husband or my kid or my mobile phone ringing? And so you have completely different stresses. So at a brand level, you need to think about those stresses before they start, and then make sure the instructors are aware of them, and you've done everything you can to help people not have those stresses so that you can maintain brand loyalty. Because anytime there's a stress, people disengage from your brand. and every time they disengage, your loyalty is kind of in jeopardy. So if you can do anything like build an overlay where you've actually got kind of instructions at the bottom of that kind of map people through the workout as you go, then people won't get lost, and then that takes away a stress. Even little things like telling the instructor to say at the start, if you get lost, don't worry, wave your hand up, I'm here to help, I'll get you back on track. Whereas I've heard some brands, I had a friend say to me, she was on an at-home video, and the instructor actually singled her out and told her she was doing it wrong. And she's not gone back to that class now because it's destroyed her kind of confidence. So I think there's just so much psychology to think about with both physical and online, and there are subtle differences that you need to consider.
Yeah, that's super powerful. I love the way that you put that when you were saying that loyalty is what's at stake with a lot of the choices that you make in terms of designing the experience. Maybe switching gears a little bit and thinking about what life is going to be like after COVID and that. I'm super curious to get your thoughts about how you think design is going to be different in a post-COVID world. Maybe kind of to share an experience that I had, which I thought was super interesting. Is actually just yesterday I went to a restaurant with my wife, and we were sitting there, and they're doing space seating, but in the middle of the restaurant there was a table that was set up with little dolls, and so that the table was set itself, they had the plates out, and then the dolls themselves were like these little mini ones, and they put on like really cute clothing on them, but it made the space feel fuller. So I was just thinking about it, like, doesn't feel so weird actually, like sitting next to these dolls and eating. So I'm curious to kind of hear, like, how do you think that brands will need to think about design post-COVID, related to things like limited capacity, maybe safety, spacing concerns, safety, and things like that?
Yeah, so we're obviously going to have to consider things. Things will change a little bit, but I think it's important to think about the difference between short-term change and long-term change. I was actually sort of on the phone to an investor the other day. We were sort of having a chat about how things might change and how, what's important to them as investors. And he said to me, it's really important that brands think about the difference between short-term change and long-term change, because in the short term, we might have to redesign the space, as you say, to accommodate limited capacity and much more kind of social distancing. I think that kind of goes without saying, but I would, especially, after chatting to him, and I think, with common sense as well, I would thoroughly recommend that you don't design your entire brand around social distancing and your entire studio around social distancing, because you're going to need that flexibility to actually, hopefully, we're all hoping COVID does go away and this doesn't happen again, but you're going to need the flexibility to go back to a much tighter capacity or less circulation space. Not just, kind of there's different reasons for that. Like, number one, if you get your equipment closer, you can increase your capacity, which means you get, you increase your bottom line because you've got more people attending your classes or attending your gym. So we're going to need to put things closer together to just make the bottom line work. But also from an actual experience point of view, like, it's interesting what you said with the dolls, but there's kind of a threshold where sometimes you're too close to other people, and I think brands overdo it with squeezing you in. But then there's a point where there's so much space that you kind of lack that energy in the room. So we're definitely going to want to be able to put things back closer together again at some point. So make sure, I think, always that you carve in some form of flexibility as much as you can. I think there's real easy wins that we can do in the fit out stage that will just make sense anyway. Like, censored taps that might not have been something we worried too much about before. We could use lever taps or all sorts of different taps before, but now I think, I would just say just put censored taps in. The design variations that there were before weren't great, but I think more censored taps coming in. They are slightly more expensive, but I think it'd be worth it. they're kind of easy wins. Anything like on a hygiene level, I think is an easy win. Improving like air circulation with the air conditioning. I mean, I think that will just be a given, that will be kind of sorted out in the air conditioning. But with the designs I'm kind of working on, we're trying to make sure that we're almost preempting if people do feel like they want to always have a one-way system, and that's something we don't know whether people will want yet, then we've kind of in the back of our mind designed it so we can say, right, we can add a door in there really easily if we want to. We just take out those 2 banks of lockers and we can add a door in, and we'll be able to have a one-way system. But there's also the ability to kind of not do that. So I think the key is flexibility really, in the design space. But I'd like to think long-term that we should be able to go back to a similar way of having our spaces, so they still feel quite high energy and quite close together. I think it'd be a real shame if we can't. And I'm not, from a safety point of view at the moment, screens are fine, but long term I'm not a big fan of kind of these glass screens at reception, because I think it's just not, I think meet and greet is so important, and for people to feel really kind of segmented and barriered off from staff isn't great for a kind of interactive point of view. I think I think flexibility is the key. It's just, we're gonna have to just see how people feel. I chatted to friends in Australia yesterday, and they've obviously been out of lockdown for ages, but he said we are all still quite nervous about being near each other. So I think we have to accept that there probably will be a phase of kind of nervousness.
Awesome. And then maybe thinking about the future and kind of talking about even beyond COVID, thinking more grander to things like economic trends, and the industry overall. Where do you think the industry is going from here? Maybe thinking 5-10 years from now.
So I think the mental health side is going to continue to grow. I don't think that's a fad. I think off the back of COVID, obviously we've all realised the importance of mental health, and it was already starting to grow anyway. So I think that will be a real trend that will continue to grow, and brands that probably haven't thought about how they incorporate that will start to incorporate that, and it could be interesting to see if there's new ways people like start attacking mental health and doing things to make us all feel happier. I think from the brick and mortar site point of view, and with gyms and things, I've heard sort of talking to agents that a lot of people are asking to look at property in residential areas. So I think there probably will be slightly different kind of way that I don't think that the gym brands will be as centralized as they were before, where they were all quite, particularly the really experiential kind of boutique fitness brands were very city centric. I think that will probably spread out a little bit. At the same time, I don't think that we've seen the end of the city, and I think there'll always still be a need for that. But I think there will be a bit more balance between kind of the city locations and the residential suburban kind of locations as well. We'll probably see more brands move out a little bit. I've spoken to a few brands as well that are kind of talking about how they're going to try and get themselves outside of the city as well. So I think we'll see that sort of change happen, which could be interesting, because I think in residential or suburban locations where people weren't necessarily, like boutique fitness wasn't necessarily even something that was on their radar, it will suddenly become on their radar. So people might start spending money on like £20 a class that were never spending £20 on a class before because they weren't used to it. So that could be quite interesting. Kind of going back to the mental health side of things, I was actually something I've been wondering if people will do. I've been reading a book called The Importance of Play recently, and it was something I hadn't really thought about, like with the mental health side of things that we all think about, you know, mindfulness and meditation and all these things. But I think COVID's been a real fun sponge for everybody, and I wonder whether there'll be any fitness brands that will grow that will actually try to take a kind of more playful aspect to things and actually maybe take things slightly less seriously. I don't know. I definitely feel like everything's got very serious, and I'd be really interested to see if some brands develop in any sector that just starts taking life less seriously and brings a bit more play into the world.
I don't have a crystal ball. I can definitely agree that I think things are much more serious at the moment. So I'm definitely curious to see how that plays off. For now, though, Sarah, I hope you don't mind. I have a couple more like personal questions with your professional development that I'd like to hit into. And the first one is related to, are there mentors or people that you look to for inspiration? And I guess this could be both in the fitness industry, or it could also be from your experience with retail, the design community, etc.
There's no, to be honest, there's no specific people that I look up to. I've had some really great bosses in my time that I learned some really great things from. I do a lot of reading, self-development type books that tend to cross from kind of entrepreneurship, business, branding, psychology, mental health, nutrition, anything like that. So I read a lot of things like that. There's a lady called, I'm sure lots of the listeners will heard of her, like Brené Brown, and she taught. What I really love is her kind of work around vulnerability, because I find that really helps inspire the way I think about branding. I just think there's understanding, as I touched on it earlier, people's vulnerabilities and things that create barriers is such a strong way to approach branding and get inside people's heads, which is what I try and do. I'm reading like The Good Psychopath's Guide to Success at the moment by Andy McNabb. So I read all sorts of books like that inspire me, and I just kind of go with the flow. I don't have one specific area that I look to for inspiration. I try to draw it up from all different areas, and I just try to be in touch with what I feel I need at that point in time. And at one point I might feel I need to boost my inspiration in business. And last week I was reading a book on SEO. So it depends kind of like what inspiration I need at that point in time. I don't have one particular person that I go to that I'm like, this is my leader.
But I definitely got out of that you definitely read your fair share of books. I think you mentioned 3 just
I
to
read
be
a lot of books.
Nice.
Religiously, my boyfriend and I, we always try and read when we get into bed every night. We make it like a habit.
Super cool. So from those relationships and that you've had, whether with mentors or just in general, maybe even from content you've read, is there any some kind of best advice that you say you had received in your career?
I've been working a little bit with a business coach recently as well, and she helps me work on like personal barriers that might affect me in business. She gave me a bit of advice, which sounds so simple, but don't catastrophize. So if there's a problem, like don't make it bigger than it actually already is, because sometimes we all tend to do that. So I have to catch myself if I'm doing that, and then actually just go back, simplify it. And that word simplification as well is probably the other best piece of advice I've had, is just always find the simplest way of doing something. And that I think applies to so many things, because in design, the best solution is the simplest solution. And sometimes there's a lot of complexity behind the scenes that you need to go through to get to the simplest solution. But what the customer experiences should be the simplest possible version of that, because when it's the simplest, it feels the most intuitive. So when you look at brands like Apple, there's a hell of a lot of complexity behind the scenes that makes their products work, but the interface that the customer works with is actually incredibly simple. And when you think of that in the fitness world, we might put a lot of thought behind a workout and how we make sure that it works with the timings and it gives you everything you need, and you've got the right warm-ups and you hit every part of the body, and there'll be lots of complexity behind the scenes. But when the customer experiences it, it needs to feel simple or they will get lost. The worst thing, I think we've all probably been there, is when you're in a class and you're trying to follow it and you're going, well, like when I first started yoga and you're in a crazy position and you're like, I don't even know what you're doing over there. So the simplest solution is always the best solution, even if there was complexity in the past. So I think the best advice I've had is really just simplification.
Nice. And then thank you. I'm stealing a bunch of, I know Kaylin has a couple more questions he wants to ask you. So before we get there, I want to throw one in real quick before I pass it back to Kaylin. But on that note, what's the best advice you've ever given?
The best advice I've probably given is, so as I said, I'm an independent, so I work for myself. So you have to think a lot about discipline and motivation and making sure you get the most out of your day. So I would say try and spot the thing that you're trying to avoid on your list. If you write a list out and there's something that you notice, you're like, oh, I'll just put that off a little bit more, then that's probably the one thing you actually need to do. So tackle that first, because you're probably putting it off because you're fearing you're going to fail at it. You would only fear you're going to fail at something that's really, really important. So try and tackle that thing first. And I think I found, like, when you actually start tackling these things, it's always so much easier than you think it will be. I think we catastrophize things in our mind, we build them up in our mind, but actually once you get started, you surprise yourself and you go, oh, that wasn't that hard. So that's probably one of the pieces of advice I think is the best I've given.
Awesome. And I was super interested when you were talking about how, when you were talking to some of your clients, they're looking at going from cities into the suburbs. I think that makes a lot of sense when you see what's happening within the world, pretty much. Are there any other things that have happened over the course of the last few months that have caused you to rethink either your clients or maybe your own business model?
Yeah, so I think when COVID first started out, in all honesty, because I think there was so much uncertainty, I'm only 3 years in, so I have the kind of luxury of being just independent as well, that I can be quite agile and I can rethink things if I want to, and reformat how I do things if I want to. I already had quite a clear idea of where I wanted to go, but it did make me panic a little bit and think, should I reprioritize things? Because I offer a package where I do like the brand strategy, the graphic design, the interior design. I built the whole brand. Because the brick and mortar sites were kind of slipping off, and that's a huge part of my business, I started to myself kind of panic and think, should I be focusing more on the graphic design side and product design and things like that? I mean, the strategy I think is relevant to online and physical, so that was fine. And I have the luxury of being able to be agile. But in all honesty, I've kind of gone full circle, because I think I've realized, and it's the same as happened with my clients, to be honest, like they panicked too and they thought, should we do things differently? But we've kind of gone full circle in a way and realized that you shouldn't throw out things that are already working quite well. Because, I've seen, I think since the vaccine started to come into place, the phone calls have come, there were still the phone calls, but like they've increased again for the brick and mortar sites, and people's confidence is starting to grow. And I've kind of had the time to reflect and think, well, actually, just because there's been this little blip, or like a year-long blip, don't throw away everything that was working really well that could actually form a basis of a really great business. And I think I touched on it earlier, just flexibility, like try and find a way to be as agile as you can and as flexible as you can. But yeah, I repeat it again, just don't throw away something that's working, as long as it is still relevant to today's world, which I'm lucky. I think the fact of the matter is no one's going to want to get rid of brick and mortar gyms. There's always going to be a need to go to a gym. So yeah, I've kind of gone full circle in a way and just gone back a little bit to my roots and stuck to things that I know I'm good at, and not try and reinvent the wheel.
I guess a follow-up on that one is, you also said that you were having this conversation with your clients as well, and having them kind of go through a similar experience as well. Can you maybe elaborate on that as well, and some of the things that they were considering as far as where they should be going, and why maybe they decided, no, we're not going to be able to do that? Because I think a lot of people who are listening today could probably be thinking about making some big changes, even potentially some of the ones that your clients were looking at doing, and it'd be interesting to know, what were some of those things that they were considering in case others are thinking of doing the same, and then why they may potentially decided to not do that, because I'm sure that these were great ideas that they were that was under consideration.
Yeah, I think one of them was around a little bit what we talked about earlier, but kind of social distancing and space planning. Some of them were sort of talking about, should we be building in screens between pieces of equipment, like permanent screens, full on panic of, should we be creating little building space so it's actually individual pods and things like that. Because before we knew about the vaccine, we didn't know how long this was going to go on for and what would happen. But everyone's kind of gone a little bit full circle and just trying to adopt this flexibility thing, really, because it doesn't really work with the bottom line to have giant pods, or certainly not in the UK, where we've got the space is a premium and sites are expensive. You can't really make the business model work for some concepts of actually spacing it out too much. So clients did panic a little bit about that. Some of them thought, should we just be not doing brick and mortar and just investing in online? But I've watched a lot of podcasts and gone to lots of these kind of virtual meetings, chatted to my clients, chatted to investors. And I think the general consensus is the future is going to be the hybrid model. It's not going to be the online only model. There's always going to be a need for the actual fitness space. So I think people are realizing that they don't want to panic and just throw the brick and mortar out of the window. And I think more and more people are realizing that the demand's going to come back, because we all want spaces where we can interact with other people. So they're the kind of main things we've sort of gone through, is thinking about, do we need to increase the space, and then going back again and saying, well, actually probably not. Let's just make sure we can change it if we need to, but not do it long term.
Earlier you were saying about how will brands introduce fun because things have kind of been so serious, and so for I can definitely say, for me, fun is super important in terms of how I work. For me, that actually creates a lot of motivation within my work environment. As weird as that might sound, I like having fun while working. And I think that it's been pretty difficult during COVID in order to have that fun aspect, which kind of like goes into a lower motivation. So I guess when you're thinking about motivation itself, and especially during these times, how do you create motivation for yourself?
Yeah, so that's a good question. And when you work for yourself on your own, like, motivation is really important, because you don't motivate yourself, your business will not work. But I think for me, the most important thing is to understand the difference between discipline and motivation. So I don't actually focus on motivation, I focus on discipline. And I think that's done me a lot of favors, because I realized that if you only show up when you feel motivated, then you're kind of not actually going to get that much done, because I think motivation comes and goes. It's really, really natural for us to have highs and lows with motivation, because motivation can be influenced by all sorts of external factors, like people calling you up with a problem, or people interrupting you, or maybe you didn't sleep well, or you didn't eat well, or whatever. Like, there's reasons, all sorts of reasons why our motivation will come and go. But discipline, if you focus on discipline and you say, right, my way of doing it is to be disciplined, I will show up every single day whether I feel like it or not, and I will just do something or do what I need to do whether I'm enjoying it or feel great about it or not, then you'll always be working on your business. Or in terms of fitness, it's exactly the same. Like, if you only go to the gym when you feel motivated, it's unlikely you're going to go 6 days a week or whatever you do. I do 6 days a week, but if you only go when you feel motivated, you're not going to be showing up every single day. But if you say, well, I'm going to be disciplined and I'm going to go every single day and I'm going to do something even when I don't want to, I bet the people that have that attitude are probably going to see better results than the people that only go when they feel like it. And I think the thing with motivation is, if you only go when you feel like it, you're going to really beat yourself up on the days where you don't go or you don't feel like it. And it can be easy to catastrophize and think, I don't feel motivated. And then you say to yourself, why don't I feel motivated? And you think you're kind of losing it, and you start going on this kind of this downward spiral. Whereas if you say, well, it's normal to sometimes not feel motivated, that's normal human pattern, I just need to be disciplined, then you kind of don't beat yourself up when you don't show up, because you always do show up. And I find that that's actually kind of accumulative. So actually, the more I show up, the more my motivation naturally goes up anyway, because I feel good, I feel confident, I feel like I'm on top of things. So having great discipline actually for me makes me motivated. And that's kind of how I work and how I kind of approach my life, I guess.
Yeah, I really like that, actually. It's a phenomenal answer. And then that was the last question that we had from our side. We did get some audience questions that came through. So let's go ahead and just go through those super quickly. So one of the questions that came in was about the spacing of equipment.
Mm-hmm.
And the question was, what should the average circulation space be around a given piece of equipment?
So if we're just talking about circulation, because obviously there's a difference between the space that you need for a piece of equipment and circulation. So to tackle both of them, when you're actually setting out your equipment, make sure you obviously speak to the manufacturer and get their guidance on the space that you need for the actual equipment. And I want to make sure that I kind of make that quite clear, just so that people understand the difference between circulation and kind of workout space, because it goes without saying, like a cable machine is going to have a different amount of space than, say, a bike, where it's quite contained. So then you've got the actual workout space, which a manufacturer will always be able to tell you what you need. But the circulation space, a kind of good guide is like 900 mil or 0.9 meters. I know we kind of all measure in different ways, but I guess that would be around 3 foot. So that's kind of quite a good guideline starting point for circulation. That will give you enough space for people to pass by each other side by side, like walking around some equipment. And that should be a good guide to kind of allow you to meet fire regulations as well. But fire regulations do vary in countries, so make sure that you check that. But that's a decent amount of circulation space that won't feel too tight. It depends a little bit on the brand as well, because if you want a brand that feels quite calm, spacious, relaxed, I think you probably want to have more than that. Whereas if you want a quite high energy brand where people feel like they're close together and bouncing off each other, then the 900 mil might work for you. You kind of need to break down the space as well into whether it's kind of key circulation space, because I think in a gym, in a big box gym, you kind of probably want a walkway that's quite wide, and that's your kind of key route, and then there'll be like little sub-circulation spaces off that. So there's quite a lot to think about. If it's a little kind of circulation space, I wouldn't really go below 750 mil. I'm not sure what that would work out in feet, but yeah, I think if you start with 3 feet and try not to go below that, or 900 mil, then that's probably a good starting point.
Great. And then this isn't going to be super connected, as I'm just kind of going down and reading the questions that came through via email from the audience. But this one is just kind of super broad, which, but I'll give you a chance to answer this one anyways, which is, what's the best design for a modern physical activity center?
That is really broad. So the best design, I guess this is where branding comes in, or where I kind of feel like I add my value. I think quite a lot of clients do come to me and think that design might. I've had people that I genuinely think that I walk into a space and I know how the design should look, but there's so much more to it than that. And I touched upon it earlier. I think that you really need to build the brand first and understand what your unique purpose is and what your target demographic are looking for. You need to understand what your workouts are about and what your brand is all about, and kind of write out a list of kind of goals and objectives for your brand before you even start the design, because you can't really benchmark what's the best in any category until you know what they are. So for one brand, they might be trying to be the best luxury brand. I'm going to use the word best. They might be trying to be the best luxury brand, and therefore they need to spend money on luxurious finishes, really like quite, I don't know, calming mood lighting, premium showers. They'll have to be spending that money to be the best in their category. You need to understand what category you're in. But if you want to be the best budget brand, then you'll be trying to do the best you can with your budget in that area. So you'll have to be quite savvy with it. It all depends what you want to be the best at. And when you talk about like kind of a physical activity center, you need to know as well what that activity is going to be, because depending on that activity, you're going to have different needs as well. So I know this is kind of like, I'm not giving a direct answer, but that's because I can't really give a direct answer, because you need to understand what your parameters are before you start. And it's not to say that that's a strange question, because that actually is really common to people who haven't worked in brand and design a lot. Is they'll say, what's the best way I can do this? And I'm like, well, let's understand what you're trying to achieve first, and then we'll work out what's the best way of doing it. Because if there was one way of doing it, everything would look the same, and then we would get no differentiation, and the world wouldn't work. You have to have unique look and feel that you can own, and a unique way of doing things that makes you stand out. That's the thing. The whole point of branding is you're basically trying to help the consumer break down their decisions, and the consumer themselves will have different objectives. So if every single thing looked exactly the same, when we walked into a supermarket, we'd get completely overloaded because everything would look the same. But brands help us break down those choices. So we see things that feel like they fit to us, and they fit to our lifestyle, and they fit to our personalities. And that's what branding is about. So I know I've skirted around it a bit, but it's about understanding the problem and the needs first.
No, I think that was a great answer, and definitely gives a lot in order to take into consideration for identifying what's best for your particular brand. So maybe jumping into the last question then that we have from the audience is, how important is color? And it goes on to say, especially background color to your online studio. And then the last piece to it is, can your choice influence adherence to your classes?
Yeah, so color is important. There's lots of color theories around ways different colors work. You should choose colors that are right for your brand. And you need to obviously define what your brand story is. Certain colors are more calming, certain colors are more confident. When you look at color, say Barry's Bootcamp, they were notorious for using red lighting in their studios because that helps pump up the blood. Whereas there's theories as well that blue lighting is better for strength training, that it helps kind of make the muscles respond in a better way. But again, some people have different theories. So color is really important. But when it comes to things like the backdrops in, say, your online videos, you want to be thinking about things like, is it on brand for starters? Because most likely when you have pictures of your kind of online workouts, they're going to end up on your social feed somewhere. So you don't want to be having colors that don't look right on your social feed or don't feel on brand. Obviously, you want to have maximum contrast, because you don't want people to not be able to see your instructor, because we don't want them to get lost. And so you obviously don't want like a black backdrop and then instructors wearing black. That's not going to be very easy to see. At the same time, if you have got a very distinct brand color, it can be helpful to use it because it can help people identify you on the gallery. But I would say, if you're really not sure what color to use on, say, your online videos, just keep it neutral, like a white or a light gray, or a brick texture or something that's really neutral. That will give you flexibility on your social feed as well, so that it will always kind of look on brand if it's neutral, because you can just intersperse it with bits of things that are on brand in your brand colors. So I think color is important, really important for branding. I'd say would be my summary. But also, when you actually pick your color, try not to choose a color that you personally like. Try and think of it as at a brand level.
I gotta ask you to elaborate on that one actually now. What are you how is that different between like choosing a color that you like versus like thinking about a color when it relates to brand? Can you elaborate on that?
Yeah, so just off the top of my head, like a good example, actually maybe out of the fitness space. I don't know if you guys are sort of aware of this brand in the UK, but say like Selfridges in the UK, they're a department store, but quite a luxury department store, and they've been around for ages. They use a very strong yellow, and that's their brand color. And part of the reason they use yellow is about confidence. And so it's a very, very confident color, and they're a very, very confident brand. They've got a lot of heritage, but they're also renowned for being excellent leaders in kind of the fashion world. And so that's just an example of one that works really well at a brand level. But if you can imagine sitting in the boardroom, there'll be people that just don't like the color yellow. You know, there'll be managers of one floor, CEOs, head of marketing. They'll all have their own personal views on color and what they like. This sounds really morbid, but it's not in that context at all. But I really love black and white. Like I love black in design. And you know, if I say to my boyfriend about painting our fence outdoors black, he's like, "What are you on?" Obviously, we did it anyway because you know, my say goes. But but you know, other people might prefer brown or a pink shade because that's what they personally like. But when we work on brands, they're big businesses, and you know, if you just put in the color that the CEO or founder is particularly fond of, that might not resonate at all with any single customer that you're going for. So you really have to try and take your personal taste out of it when you're building a brand that's for a very broad demographic, and think, what am I trying to say? Am I trying to talk about confidence, or am I trying to talk about being very, I don't know, you know, green? Am I a very environmentally driven brand? Things like pinks and pastels are quite good for, pinks and pastel colors are quite good if you want to be quite warming and calming and have a kind of quite motherly feel. So these are just things I'm trying to use, ways I'm trying to explain what brand might be trying to achieve, but you have to be outlining what your brand is about and what your core values are, and then find a color that feels like it fits to those core values.
Excellent. Yeah, thank you so much for going into more detail on that. It was really great to hear. Yeah, and we did run a bit over, so I apologize about that from our end, but this has been very great. Thank you so much, Sarah, for taking the time in order to chat with us today, share your experience and all of these great tips with us and our audience.
You're welcome. Thank you for asking me on the show. It's been a great pleasure to chat with you.
Thanks again, Sarah. We appreciate it.